The farmer struck the rock where a tree was growing, hoping to find water. But what happened next changed his life forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The heat had become a thing alive, something that pressed down from above and rose up from below, crawling into the lungs and settling there like dust. The valley lay stretched beneath the bleached sky, cracked and trembling under the weight of the sun. The ground was a broken hide of the world, fissured and gray, its wounds gaping wide enough to swallow seeds and promises alike. Nothing moved except the air, and even that only trembled in the shimmer of light that blurred the horizon. Nathan Brooks had come to think of silence as the only honest language left on his land. It covered everything: the groan of the barn's collapsing beams, the sigh of an empty windmill that no longer turned, the dry murmur of his boots crushing dead grass. He rose before dawn, as he always had, but the mornings gave him nothing now. The coolness was gone before it touched his skin. The field stretched outward, brittle and exhausted, a wide expanse that had forgotten what green meant. The sun did not rise, it arrived fierce and unmerciful, stripping the valley of shadow. The farmhouse stood like a survivor of a war that no one remembered. Its roof sagged in the middle, the boards of the porch had curled like old paper, and every window pane carried the dust of years. The pump handle at the well had lost its strength long ago. Nathan had to lean his weight into it, just to bring up a bucket of water, thick with sand. He kept that water for the animals' 2 thin cows, a scatter of hens that no longer laid eggs, and a dog too tired to bark. Inside, the rooms had taken on the same stillness as the land. The air smelled faintly of rust and old cornmeal. A single chair sat by the window, its legs uneven from years of repair. Nathan sometimes sat there when the sun began to sink, watching the light drag itself over the fields, always ending on the same place: the rock. The rock was older than memory, a broad, smooth boulder that jutted out of the ground as though the earth had pushed it upward to show its bones. It rose from the center of the field, like a monument built by something ancient and patient. And on that rock, against every law of soil and reason, grew a tree. It was a pear tree, bent and scarred, with a trunk that twisted toward the light as if it had learned defiance from the stone beneath it. Its bark was rough and furrowed, the color of ashes. Yet even in the cruelest drought, its leaves stayed green. Every spring, while the rest of the valley lay pale and dying, the tree would bloom a burst of white petals that drifted on the wind like a forgotten snow. The tree had always been there. Nathan's father used to say that his own grandfather had tried to move that rock once, believing that good soil lay trapped beneath it. But the stone would not yield. They'd hitched 2 horses and dragged until the harnesses tore. The old man broke his leg in the struggle, and afterward no one spoke of moving it again. It became a part of the farm, something both despised and revered, a stubborn heart of earth that no plow could reach. Nathan had grown up with that rock. As a boy, he'd climbed it, sat under the tree's crooked shade, and carved his initials into the trunk with a pocket knife his father gave him. Back then, the land around it was alive. Corn rose high, and the river behind the hill still carried water clear enough to see the stones beneath. Now all that remained was dust, memory, and the tree. He often found himself standing near it without remembering how he'd come there. The sight of the green leaves above the stone stirred something nameless in him. Anger, perhaps, or envy. The tree's defiance felt like mockery. It thrived where everything else withered, its roots buried not in soil but in rock. He would stare at the base of the trunk, at the way those roots gripped the stone, forcing their way into its cracks as though life could make a home even in death. Some evenings he would imagine that if he could understand how that tree lived, he might understand how to save the rest of the farm. But the answer never came. The fields remained mute, the sky gave no rain, and the land turned away from him. The days blurred together in heat and dust. Nathan's clothes carried the color of the fields. His skin darkened, his shoulders stooped. He spoke to no one. The neighbors had gone years ago, driven out by taxes and drought. Letters from the county came once in a while, folded in the same official paper, reminders of debts that could no longer be paid. He stacked them in a drawer, unopened. Sometimes at night he walked the edge of his property, counting the faint glimmers of light far away, where the new highway cut through the hills. He could hear the faint echo of trucks passing, a sound from another world. Out here, there was only stillness. Even the coyotes had stopped howling. The summer grew longer than any before it. Each sunrise came earlier, as though the sun itself was impatient to burn what remained. The ground cracked wider. Dust rose in thin spirals, drifting like smoke across the empty plain. Nathan began to dream of rain, not as water, but as salvation. He dreamed of the sound it would make on the roof, the way it would smell when it touched the dirt. When he woke, the air was silent. The well ran dry on a Wednesday. He lowered the bucket and heard it strike bottom with a hollow clatter. When he pulled it back, there was nothing but a smear of dampness at the base. He sat beside the well for a long time, staring into its darkness, listening for something that might have been an echo of water or only the ringing in his ears. That evening he walked to the rock. The sun was setting behind it, throwing long shadows over the field. The tree glowed in the fading light, the edges of its leaves shimmering gold. A few ripe pears hung heavy from the branches, small and hard but still alive. He reached up and plucked one. The skin was warm from the sun. He bit into it, and the juice ran down his chin, sweet but faintly bitter, as if the fruit carried both life and grief. He stood there eating in silence, the dry wind brushing past him, and he felt something begin to shift inside. It was not anger, not yet. It was the slow tightening of resolve, the whisper of a thought that had been waiting for years. The rock stood there, massive and unyielding, and the tree above it trembled in the evening breeze. The sight of it filled him with a strange defiance of his own. As the last light disappeared, he turned toward the house. Behind him, the tree swayed gently, its shadow stretching across the cracked earth. The field lay still, listening. He did not look back, but in his mind he saw the green leaves against the dying land and felt the quiet certainty of what would come next. The thought hardened inside him like the stone itself. If the land no longer listened, he would make it listen, and it would begin with the rock. The first light of dawn brought no relief, only the pale shimmer of another merciless day. The horizon burned faintly red before the sun climbed, and the valley exhaled its dry breath. Nathan rose from his chair before the window, his eyes heavy from a night without rest. The image of the rock and the tree had followed him through the darkness, appearing whenever he closed his eyes like a wound that refused to close. The decision he had made the previous evening hung in the air, quiet but immovable. Today he would begin. He stepped outside into the silence that seemed older than time. The yard was covered with a skin of dust that crunched softly under his boots. The cows stood motionless near the fence, ribs showing through their hides, tails flicking at flies that refused to leave. The dog lay in the shadow of the porch, eyes half open, watching him without curiosity. Nathan poured the last of the water into a rusted trough and set the bucket down beside the well. Now nothing more than a hollow throat that no longer answered. The field awaited him, brittle and sullen. Rows of shriveled corn stalks leaned toward the ground, their leaves curled tight like old paper. Every step he took released a faint whisper of broken stems. It had been the same every summer now for years, a fight against the heat, against the dust, against the silence that mocked him. He would plant, he would pray for rain, and the sky would stay empty. What once was a rhythm of life had become a ritual of defeat. By midday, the sun had turned the field into a shimmering plain of heat. He stopped at the edge, wiped his brow with the back of his hand, and looked toward the tree. The pear leaves caught the light, green as if untouched by drought. The contrast was unbearable. Around it the earth was gray and lifeless, yet the branches hung heavy with fruit. The sight kindled both admiration and rage. The tree's endurance mocked his failure. Its vitality stood as proof that the land was not dead, only unwilling to share its secrets. He remembered his father once saying that the land had moods like a person. You could coax it, anger it, or soothe it, but you could never command it. Nathan had lived by those words once, tending the fields with respect, listening to the rhythm of the seasons. But that was long ago. Now the land had turned its face away from him. He had become a stranger on soil that bore his family's name. The debt notices from the county office lay stacked on the kitchen table, unopened. He already knew what they said. The farm would be taken soon if he could not pay, and there was nothing left to sell. Machinery rusted in the shed, the grain silo stood empty, and the livestock were worth less than the cost of their feed. The farm that had survived his father's lifetime would not survive his own. That evening he stood at the edge of the field again, the air thick with the smell of dust. The rock lay in the center, unmoving, its surface reflecting the dying light. The tree swayed gently, and its shadow stretched long and thin across the earth. He walked toward it slowly, as if approaching something sacred or dangerous. When he reached the base of the rock, he placed his palm against the stone. It was warm, smooth, almost alive beneath his touch. The trunk of the pear tree rose from a crack in its center, roots wrapped around the rock like veins. The surface beneath his hand felt faintly cool in places, and he imagined that somewhere deep below, moisture waited, hidden from the burning world above. The idea had come to him slowly over the years, a thought he never dared to follow. If there was water trapped beneath the stone, perhaps that was why the tree lived when everything else died. Perhaps the rock did not curse the land, it guarded what remained of its heart. And if he could reach it, if he could free that hidden source, maybe the fields could live again. He stood there until the last light drained from the sky. Then he turned and walked back to the house. In the barn he found his father's old tools, a sledgehammer with a cracked handle, an iron crowbar, and a pickaxe blackened with age. The metal had rusted, but the edges still held their weight. He tested the heft of the pickaxe in his hands, feeling the vibration through the wood. It had been years since he had worked the ground this way, not for planting or mending, but for breaking. He left the tools by the porch and ate in silence. A plate of cold beans, a slice of bread, a glass of well water he had saved for himself. Through the open window he could see the dark outline of the field, the faint shimmer of starlight on the rock. The decision no longer frightened him. It was something beyond thought, like the final step taken by a man who has walked too far to turn back. At dawn he went to work. The air was pale and sharp, the sun still hidden behind the ridge. He slung the pickaxe over his shoulder and crossed the field. Dust rose around his boots in small clouds. When he reached the rock, the tree greeted him with the faint rustle of leaves. He paused for a moment beneath its shadow, then drove the pick into the stone. The sound rang out across the emptiness, a single metallic cry that echoed through the valley. The impact jarred his arms and shoulders, but he struck again, and again. Each blow left a faint mark, a shallow scar on the unyielding surface. Sweat began to sting his eyes, trickling down his neck. He paused only to catch his breath, then lifted the tool once more. Time ceased to exist. There was only the rhythm of the blows, the dull ring of metal, the panting breath between strikes. The rock gave nothing back. It simply absorbed his effort, indifferent. By noon the heat had become unbearable. The air shimmered, insects circled his head, and the taste of dust coated his tongue. His hands blistered and tore, blood mixing with the grit on the handle. Still he swung. When at last he stopped, the sun was directly overhead. His body trembled from exhaustion. The rock showed only a faint web of cracks, thin as veins. He sat on the ground, breathing hard, staring at them as though they were a promise. Above him, the tree's branches stirred. A few leaves fell, drifting down to rest near his boots. He looked up. The light filtered through the green canopy, fractured by movement, the air humming with a faint sound that could have been wind, or something deeper. He reached out and touched the rock again. It felt warm, but beneath the warmth there was something else, a hint of coolness, like the memory of water. As the day faded, he gathered his tools and walked back to the house. Every step sent a dull ache through his body, yet beneath the fatigue there was a strange calm, as though some ancient conversation had begun between him and the stone. The blows he had struck were not an act of destruction, but of demand. The land had ignored him for too long. Now, through the language of effort, he was forcing it to answer. Night came heavy and windless. Nathan sat by the window again, the tools resting against the porch rail, glinting faintly in the moonlight. Across the field, the silhouette of the tree rose dark and silent against the sky. He could almost feel the pull of it, as if the rock itself had drawn something from him, a part of his strength buried now in its cracks. Tomorrow he would return. Tomorrow he would strike until the stone broke, or he did. Before he went to bed, he stepped outside once more. The air smelled faintly of pear blossoms, though the season had long passed. He looked toward the rock, but the night had swallowed it whole. Only the stars burned above, cold and countless. For the first time in years, he did not pray for rain. He only whispered to the darkness, barely aware of his own voice, as if speaking to the land itself. It was not a plea, not a curse, only a promise. By morning, the fields would hear him, and somewhere beneath that unyielding stone, the earth would remember how to answer. When morning came, the light fell over the land like a pale veil, soft but merciless, revealing every scar and hollow. Nathan's body ached from the previous day's labor. His hands were stiff and raw, his shoulders heavy with the memory of the blows he had delivered. But when he stepped onto the porch, the sight of the rock standing untouched in the field filled him with renewed determination. It waited there like a challenge cast by the earth itself. The air was still cool, the sky an empty canvas of white. He took up the pickaxe once more and walked toward the center of the field. Each step was accompanied by the faint crunch of dry soil, the sound small yet steady, like a heartbeat in the silence. The first strike of the morning rang sharper than before, the echo carrying farther across the barren land. The sound awakened something in him, a rhythm both human and elemental. He struck again and again, his muscles loosening into the motion, his breath aligning with the rhythm of his swings. The rock responded with dull resistance, its surface flaking in places where yesterday's cracks had spread. A fine dust rose each time the metal bit into the stone, forming a faint cloud that shimmered in the light. Hours passed unnoticed. The sun climbed higher, the air thickened, and sweat drenched his back. The ground beneath him seemed to vibrate faintly with each impact, as if something below stirred in its sleep. When at last he paused, leaning on the handle for support, he saw that the cracks had widened. Thin, dark lines ran across the rock like veins filled with shadow. From one of them, a faint glimmer caught his eye. He crouched down and brushed the dust away with his fingers. The surface felt damp. He rubbed his thumb against it, uncertain, then pressed harder. The moisture clung to his skin, cool, unmistakable. He sat back slowly, staring at the faint sheen. The dryness of the air made the sight almost impossible to believe. There had been no rain for months, yet here, beneath the heart of the stone, water lingered. The tree above him rustled faintly, its leaves trembling, though there was no wind. Nathan tilted his head upward. The trunk looked different in the morning light. More alive, its bark gleaming faintly, the green deeper than before. It seemed to pulse with its own quiet rhythm, the roots tightening around the stone as if in response to his touch. He struck again. The sound changed. Instead of the solid ring of iron against rock, it carried a hollow undertone, faint but distinct. He froze, listening. When he tapped again, the echo returned, a dull resonance, like the sound of space beneath the surface. The realization hit him slowly. The rock was not solid all the way through. Something lay beneath. Some hollow chamber or pocket carved by time or water. He struck once more, aiming at the deepest part of the crack. The stone split with a sharp, clean sound. A sliver of light flashed as the crack opened wider. Dust poured out, and with it came a faint breath of cool air, carrying the scent of damp earth. Nathan stepped back, heart pounding. The air that escaped from the fissure was strange, heavy, and clean at once, as though it had been sealed away for centuries. He crouched again and peered into the opening. It was narrow, no wider than his palm, but dark beyond measure. He could hear something faint within it, like a whisper, the soft trickle of water moving far below. He dropped the pickaxe and pressed his ear to the surface. The sound grew clearer, rhythmic, alive. It was not the echo of a stream or a drip, but something steadier, as if the ground itself breathed. He remained there for several minutes, motionless, listening to that slow pulse rise from the depths. It filled him with an awe that bordered on fear. For years, the land had given him nothing but silence, and now for the first time, it spoke. By midday, clouds gathered at the edges of the sky, thin gray smears that promised nothing. The wind rose in short gusts, carrying dust across the plain. Nathan stood before the rock, staring at the dark line that now cut across its surface like a wound. The tree's branches swayed restlessly, and he could feel the hum of tension in the air. The soil around the base of the stone had softened. When he stepped closer, his boots sank slightly, leaving a faint impression filled with dust and shadow. He wiped his brow and swung the pick once more, aiming not at the crack, but at its edge. The blow sent a sharp vibration through the ground, followed by a faint tremor. The sound beneath the earth deepened, shifting from a whisper to a low murmur that rippled outward across the field. He froze again, every sense alert. The noise faded slowly, but its memory lingered in his bones. He was not alone here, not in the way he once thought. The earth was aware of him now, listening, responding. That night sleep refused to come. He lay on his bed staring at the ceiling as the shadows of the tree branches flickered across the window pane. The air inside the house was stifling. He could hear faint noises from outside, the soft creak of the porch boards, the distant groan of wind through the barn, and beneath it all, an echo of the same slow rhythm he had heard through the stone. It was faint, almost imagined, but it pulsed through the night like the beating of a buried heart. Sometime after midnight, he rose and stepped outside. The moon hung low, a pale coin in a haze of dust. The field shimmered faintly under its light. He walked barefoot through the dry grass, the ground cool beneath his feet. When he reached the rock, he saw that the crack was glistening. A thin line of moisture traced its length, reflecting the moonlight like silver. He touched it. The water was cold, unnaturally cold. He tasted it, and it was clean. No salt, no dirt, only the sharp clarity of something drawn from deep beneath the earth. He stood there for a long time, letting the droplets run over his fingers. It was beautiful, but it unsettled him. The land that had refused to give him life was now bleeding it freely, and he did not understand why. He looked up at the tree, its leaves whispering faintly. The sound was almost human, a rustling that seemed to form words he could not quite hear. He took a step back, the chill of the water still on his hand, and for a moment he thought he saw the tree tremble, not from the wind, but from within, as though the roots themselves were stirring. By dawn, the moisture had spread. The ground near the rock was darkened, the soil damp to the touch. Nathan knelt and pressed his palm into it. The water pooled instantly around his skin, rising from beneath in slow, steady beads. It was not seeping from rain or runoff. It was coming from below. He followed the cracks outward, tracing their paths across the field. They ran in strange, branching patterns, all leading back to the rock, as though the stone were the heart of the land and the fissures were its veins. The sun rose behind the hills, throwing long shadows over the field. He stood motionless, staring at what he had done. A faint sense of triumph flickered within him. He had forced the earth to yield, to reveal what it hid. But beneath that triumph came unease. The water's emergence was not natural. It was too sudden, too insistent. He watched it glimmer on the soil and wondered if he had awoken something that should have remained asleep. By evening, the air smelled different, cooler, sharper, touched with the scent of stone and dampness. The tree above the rock seemed greener than ever, its branches heavy, its roots invisible beneath the swelling ground. The cracks had deepened, and in the fading light, he thought he saw movement within them, a slow shimmer as if something far below was breathing through the earth. He turned toward the house, his body aching, his mind crowded with questions he could not answer. As he reached the porch, he glanced back one last time. The field lay quiet, but the rock glistened faintly, catching the last light of the sun. For a heartbeat, he thought he heard it again. The faint, steady pulse from beneath, rising through the ground and echoing in his chest. It was not the sound of danger or warning, but of awakening. The earth had begun to move, and though he did not yet understand it, he knew that whatever slept beneath the stone was no longer sleeping. By the next morning, the world had changed in ways that only a man who lived close to the soil could feel. The air carried a faint tremor that didn't belong to the wind, and the ground beneath Nathan's boots seemed softer, as though it had forgotten how to bear weight. When he stepped from the porch, a thin mist drifted across the field, a pale vapor rising from the dampened cracks that circled the rock. He paused, uneasy, listening to the low hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sky was cloudless, yet the air smelled of rain, sharp and metallic, a scent that had not touched the valley in months. He walked slowly toward the center of the field, his heart heavy with both awe and fear. The pear tree stood where it always had, yet now it seemed somehow taller, fuller, as if it had drawn strength from the night itself. The leaves shimmered faintly, even without wind, the branches moving in a slow rhythm that felt alive in a way he could not explain. The rock beneath it gleamed darkly, the cracks spreading wider, the moisture that seeped from them no longer a trickle but a steady, glistening flow. It pooled around the base, turning the dust into mud that clung to his boots as he approached. He knelt and touched the edge of one fissure. The water was cool, almost cold, and when he pressed his hand deeper into the mud, he felt the faintest vibration. It pulsed against his skin in slow intervals, deep and deliberate, like the beat of something vast hidden below. The sensation traveled up his arm, and for a moment he thought he heard a whisper, a faint murmur that came not through his ears but through his bones. He drew his hand back quickly, wiping it on his trousers, though the sound remained within him. The sky brightened as the sun climbed, yet the light felt strange, muted. The horizon shimmered, not from heat as before, but from the fine vapor that now hung above the land. He looked around and realized that dampness had spread beyond the tree. Dark patches marred the soil in widening circles, reaching toward the far rows where the last withered corn stood. The earth was waking, and it no longer obeyed him. He returned to the house for his tools, though part of him didn't know why. Habit guided his hands, the pickaxe, the spade, the crowbar, but there was no plan left, only the need to understand what he had uncovered. As he walked back to the field, he felt the wind rise, soft at first, then stronger, carrying with it a low, hollow sound that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. It wasn't the cry of the wind through trees or the sigh of shifting leaves. It was deeper, slower, like air moving through a great unseen chamber. When he reached the rock, he set down the tools and crouched again beside the largest crack. The air rising from it was no longer cool. It carried warmth now, and a faint trace of something old, a scent of minerals and rot and time. He leaned closer, listening. The sound from below had changed. What was once a slow pulse had become a rhythmic rush, the unmistakable movement of water through stone. He could hear it swirling, striking against hidden walls, carving its path through the darkness beneath his feet. He took the spade and began to dig near the base of the rock where the soil had softened. The mud gave way easily, too easily, as though the ground had lost its structure. Each shovelful brought up darker, wetter earth. Water pooled quickly in the holes he made, filling them as fast as he could empty them. He dug until his arms trembled, until the spade struck something hard. When he cleared the mud away, he saw not more rock, but an edge of metal dull, smooth and curved. At first he thought it might be a buried pipe, though there had never been such a thing on his land. He scraped away more dirt, uncovering a broader section of it. The surface was rusted, but the shape was deliberate, crafted, not natural. It disappeared into the ground in both directions. He rapped it with the handle of his spade, and the sound that came back was hollow, a deep echo that reverberated far beneath. He dropped the tool and stepped back, his breath quickening. The hollow beneath the rock was not small, it was enormous. He sat there for a long time, staring at the glistening patch of exposed metal, the water seeping around it. The field was utterly silent except for the faint, steady bubbling from below. He tried to convince himself it was an old cistern, maybe a forgotten water tank left from some generation before, but no one in his family had ever mentioned anything buried here. His grandfather had told him everything about the land, every fence post, every stone, every root that mattered, and nothing like this had ever been spoken of. The wind picked up again, sharper this time, carrying dust that swirled around him before vanishing into the mist. The tree shivered, its branches groaned softly, the sound echoing across the open field. He looked up and saw that the leaves near its crown had darkened, their edges curling inward as though burned from within. A faint drip began at the base of the trunk, clear water running down the bark to mix with the mud below. He reached out to touch it and felt a strange pulse, as if the tree itself had a heartbeat. As the day wore on, the flow of water increased. It streamed from the cracks in the rock, pooling around the roots of the tree, spreading outward through the furrows of the field. The earth no longer looked parched. It shimmered with a film of moisture that caught the sunlight like glass. But there was no joy in the sight, no hope. The air carried a deep vibration that hummed in his chest, and the ground seemed to shift almost imperceptibly under his weight. That night, he could not eat. He sat by the window as he had done so many times before, watching the moon rise over the valley. The fields that had once glowed white with dust now glimmered with faint reflections, as though the land had become a mirror. The sound of water reached him through the stillness, a quiet, continuous murmur that filled the dark. He could not tell if it came from outside or from the earth beneath the house itself. Sometime after midnight, he thought he heard another sound, one that made his blood run cold, a creak, low and drawn out, like stone under pressure. The floor beneath his feet vibrated. The dishes on the shelf rattled faintly. Then silence again, heavy and absolute. He waited for the noise to return, but it didn't. When he finally lay down, he dreamed of the tree's roots spreading through the ground like black veins, wrapping around something vast and shining deep below, something that moved slowly, breathing in the dark. The morning brought a strange calm. The air was cooler, but the sky was pale and colorless. When he stepped outside, he found that the ground near the house was damp. Small puddles had formed in the hollows where dust used to lie thick. The water was clear and still, reflecting the gray of the sky. He followed the trail back toward the field. The soil grew softer with each step, and when he reached the rock, he stopped. The fissure had widened overnight. It gaped open now, a dark wound running through the center of the stone. From its depths came a steady stream of water that poured into the earth below. The tree's roots had sunk deeper into the split, twisting into the darkness like searching fingers. The sound of moving water was louder, no longer a whisper, but a low, throbbing rush that seemed to rise from the heart of the valley itself. Nathan knelt beside it and peered into the darkness. A faint current of air moved upward from the crack, warm and wet, carrying the same scent of minerals he had noticed before. He realized then that the rock was hollow not by accident, but by design. The metal beneath it was not a remnant. It was part of something larger, something buried deeper than any man could have placed there by hand. Whatever lay below had been waiting, sealed off from the world until he struck it. He felt both wonder and dread in equal measure. The water was not a gift, it was an opening. He rose slowly, his knees sinking into the wet ground. Around him, the field shimmered with thin rivulets that wound their way outward, forming new channels where none had existed before. The earth had begun to move on its own, reshaping itself. In the distance, a faint sound echoed, something between a sigh and a groan. He turned his head toward it, but there was nothing to see, only the pale horizon and the faint haze of moisture rising from the soil. For a long moment he stood motionless, the sound of the buried water filling the silence around him. Then, without knowing why, he whispered into the wind, "I hear you." The air shifted in response, soft and deliberate, as if something beneath the ground had drawn breath. The mist thickened, curling around his legs. The field that had once been silent now trembled faintly, alive with the pulse of what he had awakened. And as the first shadow of evening crossed the land, Nathan realized that he had not only broken the stone, he had broken the silence that kept the world in place. The next dawn rose through a veil of mist that clung low to the fields, heavy and slow-moving, as if the land itself exhaled. Nathan woke to the sound of dripping water somewhere near the house. For a moment he thought it might be rain, and his heart leapt. But when he stepped onto the porch, the sky was clear. The sun was rising over the hills, pale and distant, and yet the air was thick with moisture. The boards beneath his feet were damp. His boots sank into the soft ground where dust had once been. A new scent filled the air, Wet clay, fresh roots, and something older, deeper, that stirred memory more than thought. He walked toward the field, his breath visible in the cool morning air. Each step brought a faint, sucking sound from the mud. The valley that had once been brittle and silent now shimmered, alive with the movement of water. It ran in small streams across the furrows, gathering in pools that reflected the gray sky. Birds circled overhead, cautious but drawn by the promise of change. The tree stood in the center of it all, its branches heavy and dark, the bark glistening as if the night had coated it with oil. The rock beneath it was no longer visible in full. The fissure he had opened had widened beyond anything he could have imagined. Half of the stone was submerged in water that gurgled up steadily from the earth, not in violent bursts, but in an endless, quiet flow. The surface of the water rippled with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. It was beautiful and terrifying at once. He approached slowly, watching the roots of the pear tree twist and move beneath the surface, their pale lengths writhing like living things. He knelt by the water's edge and reached in. It was warm now, not cold as before, and when he lifted his hand, it glistened with a faint sheen that smelled faintly metallic. He wiped it on his shirt and watched the damp mark spread wider than it should have, as though the moisture had a will of its own. Beneath the reflection of the tree, he thought he saw movement in the water, a dark flicker deep below, like something vast turning in its sleep. The air trembled. It was not the wind, it was the earth. A deep sound rolled through the valley, low and endless, a vibration that passed through soil, water, and bone alike. The surface of the water rippled outward in perfect circles. Nathan rose to his feet, his body tense. The sound continued for several seconds, then faded, leaving behind a silence even more oppressive than before. He could feel it beneath him still, a subtle throbbing that seemed to come from miles below. He turned and looked around. The moisture had spread far beyond the field now. Where the land dipped, pools had formed. The dry ditches that once cracked underfoot were filled with water that moved sluggishly toward the center, feeding the new spring that had erupted from beneath the rock. The soil was no longer the dust-gray color he had known all his life. It had darkened to the deep brown of fertile earth. Grass had begun to grow in uneven patches along the edges of the field, tender and impossibly green. The sight should have filled him with hope, but it only deepened his unease. The change was happening too quickly. As the sun climbed higher, the ground softened further. When he walked, his boots left deep impressions that filled almost immediately with water. The air grew warm and close, and every breath carried the taste of metal and decay. Insects returned first, hovering in small clouds above the water. Then came the frogs, their voices echoing in a chorus that had not been heard here in years. Life was returning, but it came with a feverish intensity that felt unnatural, as if the land, after years of silence, now rushed to reclaim all it had lost in a single breath. By afternoon, the sound beneath the ground grew stronger. He could hear it even inside the house, a constant murmur that seemed to follow him from room to room. The walls trembled faintly, the glasses on the shelf clinking together in a slow rhythm. Once or twice he thought he felt the floor shift beneath his feet, a subtle sway that made his stomach twist. He told himself it was only his imagination, that exhaustion had dulled his senses. But when he stepped outside again, the horizon itself seemed to move, trembling as though seen through heat. The tree was changing. Its leaves had darkened almost to black, and the fruit that hung from its branches had swollen, their shapes distorted. Some had burst open, spilling a pale sap that dripped into the water below. The roots had broken through more of the ground, reaching outward in thick cords. He could see them pushing through the mud, weaving in and out like serpents seeking new soil. The rock beneath was almost entirely hidden now, swallowed by the expanding pool. He tried to dig a channel to divert the water away from the field. The first trench filled within minutes, the second within seconds. The earth seemed to resist him, collapsing into itself, closing whatever space he tried to create. Sweat poured from his face as he worked, his clothes clinging to his skin. The air felt heavier with every breath, filled with the scent of dampness and something else, something old, mineral and faintly sweet, like rot buried for generations. When the sun began to sink, the ground around the tree shifted. It started with a faint tremor, then a soft cracking sound like ice breaking on a pond. The tree tilted slightly, its roots straining against the weight of the earth. Nathan froze where he stood, watching. The sound grew louder, joined by the deep groan of moving soil. A sudden plume of muddy water burst upward, splashing across his boots. The ground sagged beneath him, and for a moment he thought the entire field might collapse. He stumbled back toward the fence, his breath ragged. The tree shuddered again, its branches thrashing though there was no wind. The water around its base turned murky, swirling as though stirred from below. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the movement stopped. The air stilled. The tree stood upright again, though its roots were now half exposed, gripping the sinking stone like a desperate hand. As twilight fell, he sat at the edge of the field, too drained to move. The light faded slowly, turning the water a deep, reflective black. Fireflies blinked in the reeds that had already begun to grow along the edges of the pools. The sound of frogs grew louder. The valley looked almost alive again, but it was not the life he remembered. It was something raw, untamed, and ancient. Something that made him feel like an intruder on his own land. When night came fully, he returned to the house and stood at the window, watching the faint glimmer of water in the darkness. The murmur from beneath the ground had not stopped. If anything, it had deepened. The entire valley seemed to be breathing now, a slow, heavy rhythm that made the walls vibrate and the air quiver in his chest. He pressed his palm to the window pane and felt it tremble faintly beneath his touch. He had wanted to wake the earth, to bring life back to his fields. Now the earth was awake and it was breathing. But its breath was not for him. It belonged to something deeper, older than any man's labor or prayer. And as he stood there, staring out at the living darkness that had swallowed his land, he understood that he had traded the silence of death for the voice of something far more powerful, a voice that would not stop until it had spoken its full measure. The morning broke without birdsong. The mist that had hung low over the valley during the night had thickened into a silver haze that blurred the horizon and muffled every sound. The house stood half submerged in damp air, its wooden boards slick with condensation. Nathan awoke to the smell of wet earth and silence, not the lifeless silence of the drought years, but a deeper one, filled with quiet motion, the kind that comes after something immense has settled into place. He opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The world that greeted him was unrecognizable. Where the fields had once stretched dry and cracked, there now lay a wide sheet of water that shimmered faintly under the rising sun. It reached almost to the foot of the house, its surface smooth and still, reflecting the gray sky like glass. In the middle of that new expanse stood the tree, or what was left of it. The trunk leaned at an angle, its branches stripped of most of their leaves, its roots half submerged in the water that had swallowed the stone completely. The air smelled of growth and decay in equal measure, sweet and heavy. He walked down from the porch slowly, feeling the mud pull at his boots. The sound of his steps was the only one in the valley. When he reached what had once been the edge of his field, he stopped and looked out. The water stretched far beyond his property line now, a mirror where hills and sky met without boundary. The faint ripple of a breeze disturbed the surface, sending rings of light across the flooded plain. It was not destruction, nor was it creation. It was something between, something that seemed to breathe. Nathan stood there for a long time, the damp wind tugging at his sleeves, and felt the weight of what had happened. The field he had fought for, the soil his father and grandfather had turned with their own hands, was gone. Yet as he stared at the water, he understood that the land was not lost. It had simply become something else. Beneath that calm surface, life was already stirring. He could see small movements, ripples near the base of the fallen tree where fish or insects had found their way. What had seemed ruin was now renewal, though it had taken everything he knew to bring it forth. He waded a little closer to the edge, the water cool around his ankles. The ground was soft but stable beneath the surface. He reached down, scooped up a handful of the wet soil, and let it slip through his fingers. It was rich, dark, alive. The smell of it filled his chest and made him close his eyes. The earth had not died. It had only changed its form. The drought, the silence, the breaking of the stone, all of it had led to this moment of balance between ending and beginning. When he opened his eyes again, he saw movement near the tree. A small stem had risen from the shallows beside the fallen trunk, a thin green shoot swaying in the breeze. He stepped closer and crouched beside it. It was unmistakable, a young pear tree, its leaves small and bright, trembling with fragile life. It had taken root in the very place where the old one had fallen, where the rock had once sealed the earth shut. The sight filled him with a quiet reverence that words could not touch. Life had found its own way back, uninvited, uncommanded. He sat by the water for a long time, watching the surface shift with the wind. The mist began to lift as the sun climbed higher, and with it came sound again. The distant call of birds returning, the faint hum of insects newly born from the damp ground. A dragonfly hovered near his shoulder, then darted out across the lake, its wings catching the light. Everything that had been buried, everything that had struggled in silence, now stirred with movement. For the first time in many years, Nathan felt no urge to fix, to fight, or to shape. The land no longer needed him in that way. It had taken back its voice, and it would speak in its own time. He could only listen. He thought of his father's words, remembered from a lifetime ago. The land holds what you give it. If you wound it, it remembers. If you free it, it breathes. He understood them now in a way he never had before. The land had been bound by stone, by time, by the stubbornness of men who thought they could master it. And when he broke that stone, he had broken the silence that bound it too. Days passed and the new lake settled into its shape. The edges grew soft with reeds and grasses. Birds nested in the shallows and frogs filled the nights with their calls. The water no longer rose or fell. It simply existed, as steady as the sky above it. The house remained on its small rise, untouched by the flood, standing as a quiet witness to the transformation. People from nearby towns began to visit, drawn by stories of a lake that had appeared from nowhere. They called it Jackson's Pond, though Nathan thought of it as something older, something nameless that belonged not to him, but to the valley itself. He spoke little to the visitors. They came and went, taking photographs, whispering to each other, speculating about underground rivers and geological faults. Some offered to buy the land. He turned them all away. He did not try to explain what had happened. There was no explanation that could make sense to anyone who hadn't heard the silence of a dying field, who hadn't felt the earth breathe beneath their hands. As the seasons turned, the land around the water grew fertile again. Grass covered the slopes where the soil had been bare, and wildflowers appeared in colors he hadn't seen since childhood. He planted nothing. The earth no longer needed his interference. He mended the fence by habit, kept the house standing, but his days were quieter now. He spent them by the shore, watching the young pear tree grow taller each week, its leaves bright against the water's reflection. Sometimes, when the evenings were still and the surface of the lake mirrored the red sky, he would think he heard the faint hum again, the deep, slow pulse that had once come from beneath the rock. It no longer sounded like a warning or a secret. It was simply the sound of the world living, the echo of something vast and eternal that flowed beneath all things. He would sit there until the stars appeared, until the wind carried the scent of wet earth and young leaves, and he would breathe with it, steady and unafraid. One evening, near the end of autumn, he found himself standing by the tree at sunset. The water was calm, the air crisp. The young tree's leaves had turned golden, catching the last light of the day. He reached out and touched its trunk. It was firm and cool beneath his hand, filled with life that needed no tending. The wind passed softly over the water, and for a moment he could almost hear words in its whisper, something like gratitude or perhaps recognition. He smiled then, a small, quiet smile that came not from triumph but from peace. The land no longer asked for his labor or his sacrifice. It had claimed its own balance, its own truth. The stone, the drought, the flood, all of it had been part of a single long breath, drawn deep beneath the surface of things. Now that breath had been released, and the valley rested again. When night fell, he turned back toward the house. The moon rose over the new lake, casting a path of silver across its surface. Behind him, the young pear tree swayed gently, its reflection trembling in the water. The earth was silent once more, but it was a living silence now, filled with the memory of its awakening. And as he walked home, Nathan felt the quiet settle into him as well, not as emptiness, but as peace, the kind that comes when a man finally understands that the world has never belonged to him, but that he has always belonged to it. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you won't miss what's coming next. There are more unbelievable stories waiting for you. Click now to watch the next one and share this video with someone who needs to see it.